Hey everybody, it's Mr. Hoin. For week 5's assignment, this week we're going to be focusing on gender equality, and this assignment is going to take a little bit shorter amount of time than the previous ones. In fact, the deadline for this week's assignment is going to be Wednesday, and if it shows up on Thursday, Friday, that's as well, but on Thursday of this week, we're going to be launching our final project, or your final project, and on Thursday I'll be uploading all the materials for that. I really want you to get started as soon as possible on the final project because so much of your grade in this class will ride on this final project. Cannot emphasize that enough. But this week we're going to get started on gender, and specifically gender equality, which is our last unit to cover in this Perspectives on Race class and Gender class. Before watching the rest of this lecture, it's important for you to answer questions number 1 and 2 on the worksheet that I provided you. I gave you both Google Doc and a Microsoft Word version. And before we go any further, I need you to pause the video now and answer questions number 1 and 2. Do that right now. All right, we're back, and I want to talk a little bit about the gender issue and set that up for you. I would have done this in class, and I hope you pay close attention. For much of human history, people have lived in what is known as a binary world, especially when it comes to sort of male and female roles. These three terms that relate to gender need to be fully understood before we go much further, and that is sex, gender, and sexual orientation. And all three of these things have fit into this binary model, a clear male side and a clear female side. But the world has changed quite a bit, especially over the last 50 some odd years as it relates to these three terms. And before we go any further, we need to understand what these three terms mean. All right, so first of all, sex. We need to understand a baseline for all three of these terms. First of all, sex is a person's anatomy, their sexual chromosomes, their biology, all right? Gender, which is what we're going to be focusing on, is the behavioral, cultural, or psychological traits that are typically associated with one sex versus the other, all right? I know that's sort of a wordy definition, but hopefully that will come to more clarity as we move along this. The last one is sexual orientation, and sexual orientation is the physical, emotional, or romantic attractions that we have to other people, all right? Typically in the binary world, males were attracted to females and vice versa. But all throughout history, those lines have also blurred with homosexuality and then transgenderism and a whole variety of things that have sort of become more prevalent and more aware in our society. As I said, we're going to be focusing on gender issues and specifically gender equality. But before we go much further, I have another Hoin timeline here for you to understand the gender issue here. So my timeline here is a very long one, 17,000 years. And the beginning of my timeline, as you can see here, begins roughly 15,000 years before Christ. This is generally acknowledged by most historians as the beginning of human civilization. We begin to see civilizations develop in the Mesopotamian Fertile Crescent region of the Middle East and in northern Africa. You begin to see civilizations develop, larger and larger civilizations begin to grow. The end of our timeline here brings us right up to the present, 2020, and as you can see here, this here represents year 1, the year of Christ's birth, which is the Christian calendar that humanity has sort of used over the course of the last 2,000 years. But this whole timeline is 17,000 years, and the reason why I laid out this timeline this way pertains to the information that's in this yellow box here. since pretty much the beginning of human civilization, women have played a subordinate and or domesticated role in almost all societies that have developed on planet Earth. And that's really important to understand, is that for pretty much 17,000 years, this binary world of a male filling this role and a female filling this role has generally been assumed by almost all cultures and civilizations on planet Earth through this 17,000 years. And this gender inequality that existed between male and females was perpetrated for literally 17,000 years until we get to 1848, the beginning of what is known as the first wave of feminist revolution begins. The feminist revolution really begins here in the United States. This is when a group of women and a select group of men begin to voice their opposition to these binary models, and that women deserved to be treated equally, especially as it related to voting. Let's never forget that women were not allowed to vote until 1920. But back in 1848, you saw a select group of women begin to voice themselves and demand more political equality. And hopefully that would translate into more social equality. All right? Today, I think it's fair to say that this binary model that we've sort of been living under for 17,000 years is starting to crumble and fade away. Many women have become political leaders, business leaders. The pay gap between men and women, as you'll see later in the lecture here, is still not closed. There is still a gap that exists between that. And the development of this so-called Me Too movement, where women are standing up and saying that sexual exploitation and sexual discrimination can no longer be tolerated. And I think that's an important sort of current event to underscore here. The Me Too movement represents a very important part of our contemporary history. And if you don't know what the Me Too movement is, I encourage you to dive more deeply into it. But it's really sort of women bringing to light the fact that they have been treated by men in a sexually exploitive way. All right? I want to talk about these spheres of influence that that men and women have sort of lived under for a long time, until this period of 1848, where we begin to see more of a crossover and a blending between these two roles. For the longest time, men sort of dominated the workplace. They dominated our political systems. Men were perceived as the sexual conqueror, the ones that were always the more assertive when it came to sexual relations. Females filled a very traditionally domesticated role. Mothers, taking care of the house. They represented moral purity. Nothing reflects that better than sort of the white wedding dresses. That white is purity, and women were always expected to sort of maintain their purity all the way through marriage. Their sexual role was that of really the mother. You know, they had sex to give birth to a new generation of children. And as I said, back in 1848, what you saw is a group of women who basically said that these distinct roles on both sides really needed to start fading away, and that women especially needed to be recognized as equals to men, and this crossover really needed to sort of happen on more levels. Let's get a baseline understanding of what feminism is and the feminist movement. Feminism is the belief that women and men should have equal rights and opportunities. The feminist movement is activity that focuses on issues related to sexuality, issues related to family, issues related to workplace, reproductive rights, and legal inequalities. The first feminist movement happened, as I said, in 1848, and over that time you saw various waves of feminism sort of rise up in society. The most important wave happened in the late 1960s and exists still into the present. This second wave of feminism really kicked off in the late 60s as a result of the civil rights movement, where Martin Luther King Jr. opened up the door for all Americans and all citizens really to recognize the equality that exists, not just based on the color of your skin, not just based on ethnicity, but gender. Is that women were fed up of being sort of relegated to this subordinate domesticated role, and they wanted to be treated more equally. And this really begins to take off in this second feminist wave of the late 1960s, early 70s. I have a very quick, short history here on feminism in the United States. I'm going to go through this very quickly, so bear with me, but it's important to get a general understanding of the historical timeline here. In 1848, the event that really triggers this first wave of feminism is a women's right convention held in Seneca Falls, New York. This is where a large group of women and a select group of men come together and really start to formulate a plan of how they're going to achieve a greater degree of equality. And first and foremost in this is the fight for the right to vote. That was fundamental to the women's right movement in the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. In 1920, finally women get the right to vote, and this would require a amendment to the Constitution. That is the 19th Amendment, and the 19th Amendment finally allows women to vote in national elections. In 1941, 1945, this is, of course, is when the United States is involved with World War II. And when the men are off fighting World War II, someone's got to stay behind and work in the factories and make all of the war goods and supplies and resources that both the citizens at home and the soldiers abroad are going to need. With so many men fighting in World War II, it really fell on women to be the ones working in factories, making the bombs, the bullets, the airplanes, the tanks, and everything. And what you begin to see in this World War II period is over 6 million American women starting to do manufacturing jobs that men used to do. And when the men come back from war, once the war is over, women begin to recognize that, like, hey, I can do a job just as good as any guy. And this really starts to plant a seed in many women in the 1940s, moving into the 50s, where you'll begin to then see this blossoming of this second revolution happen. But World War II was a very important moment to sort of implant the idea into women that they can do any job just as good as a man. As I noted, the late 1960s into the early 1970s, you begin to see this second wave of the feminist movement. Another major event that happens during this period is the introduction of the birth control pill, which, as you will see in a short video that I have provided you, really is a trigger moment, once again, to sort of give women a greater degree of freedom and power when it came to their reproduction rights and their reproduction abilities. And you'll find more about that in a second. In 1973, a major Supreme Court case happened called Roe versus Wade. This is when the federal government basically said that no state can prohibit a woman from getting an abortion in their first trimester. Then it left it up to the states in the second trimester to make that abortion process more difficult to get. But it really became the first time that the federal government sort of stepped into the issue of reproduction rights as it relates to abortion. And it really is, again, another critical moment to sort of empower women with that the issue of reproduction. and you'll learn more about that in the video that's coming up, which is in fact this video right here. Right now I need you to pause the video and watch the various clips that I have noted in your worksheet. There are very specific times that you have to watch in order to answer very specific questions. Please pause the tape now and answer question 3 through 10. And when you're done with question 10, then come back to the video here. So pause the tape now, answer questions 3 through 10. All right, so I think that video did a marvelous job of illustrating the impact of this second wave of feminism that happened in the late 60s, early 70s, and how that changed not just American women, but women throughout the planet until you get to where we are today. And I think where you have today, and what I've done here is single out a series of women that have played very important roles in our society over the last several decades. Some very controversial. What I think is really fascinating here is that a majority of the women that are featured on this slide are minority women. Oprah Winfrey, the CEO of PepsiCo, Sonia Sotomayor, who's the Supreme Court Justice, Tierra Quinn, who is one of the most important NASA scientists, Ursula Burns, who's the CEO of the Xerox Corporation. These are very, very important women that have achieved tremendous success both in the business and political world, and they've served as role models for other women that they can do it as well. Here's what came out of the feminist movement in the late 60s, early 70s. More women are going to pursue college degrees. We begin to see this in the present, where almost more than 50% of the people that are pursuing college degrees are women. What you also begin to see is that once women become more educated, they are going to want to work and achieve business success. Now that they're working and their husbands are working, you're going to begin to see the growth of two career families, two family incomes coming into the household. You're also going to be seeing employers make family life accommodations like daycare, working from home. You're also, as you see here, women are going to achieve significant leadership positions. This next slide here, I'm going to ask you to analyze two graphs, which are also featured on your worksheet. I want you to closely analyze these two graphs and then answer question number 11. So pause the tape right now, look at the graphs, answer question 11, and then come back. All right, so here's some general words of wisdom as it relates to the women who are watching this video. Many of you have hopefully college plans. Many of you have aspirations to become a mom. But for those of you that are pursuing a higher level of business success, the women who are watching this tape, I wanted to share with you 4 pieces of advice that I've received both from my own wife, who's a successful working woman, and from other women who have achieved great success. Many of them have always singled these elements out. If you are going on to college, choose your major carefully. And here's what I mean by that. Most of the jobs that pay equal to men are traditionally male-dominated jobs before all this feminist movement. Science, engineering, high levels of business. These are the areas where you see more balance in the income of men and women. Very important to stay assertive and always persist. Don't take no. Voice your opinion. And sometimes that can backfire. I'm not going to lie to you. If you are seen as too aggressive a woman, that can backfire. But I have come to recognize that many men appreciate and respect the idea of women sort of speaking up for themselves, advocating for themselves, not taking no for an answer. and being persistent in what they want. Very important to know and use your resources. That means understanding the government agencies, understanding discrimination laws. If you feel that you're being discriminated against, where do you go to sort of achieve some degree of justice? So that means understanding how the system works. And the only way to understand the system works is to sort of dive deeply into the various elements within the system to understand what your rights are. And then lastly, maintaining a strong women network. This is really important for women to sort of work alongside women and sort of develop a circle of contacts that they can fall back on to use when it's time to find a job or time to get advice. So maintain a strong circle of women friends. All right, unfortunately, we're simply not going to have time to dive deeply into LGBTQ issues. I really wish that we had more time to do that. However, I want you to read a brief speech that was given by a very famous civil rights leader, this guy right here, Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin worked alongside Martin Luther King Jr., and he was also openly homosexual at a time when being homosexual was extremely taboo. And he put himself at enormous risk to reveal himself as homosexual, especially a homosexual black man during the Civil Rights Movement. In 1986, he gave a very famous speech to a group of students at the University of Pennsylvania. And I want you to read a short excerpt of that speech and then answer only 4 questions related to that. So please do that now. But before you do that, just a very, very, very quick history on feminism in America. Once again, sort of a short timeline. Not feminism, this is as it relates to LGBTQ